Welcome to week 5. This is midterm week, and so this week I decided we're not going to have a required team project component. It could have gone either way, but I thought, well, teams probably need to get together and talk about how things are going, update a few things, maybe update the team charter a little bit, just to get everybody on track. The weeks subsequent to this one, 6, 7, and 8, will be the unfreeze, move, and freeze phases of the change process. So this week is a good opportunity to strategize with your team members to make sure that you can tackle it as you go. Now remember, we're going to be using Cotter's model, and that's integrated into Levine's model, so it's both overlapping. You'll see in a second how I've done that. And so what you'll be doing is essentially, more or less, for each of Cotter's steps, his 8 steps, you'll be explaining what's going on in the company or what should go on in the company to do it. That's it. But there is some stuff to think about, and so I will give some clarifying notes each week, week 6, 7, and 8, so you can see what we're after. For example, everybody knows that Cotter's first step is creating a sense of urgency. But if you just say that, you don't say anything else, like what do you mean? Just run around scared, just run around screaming? It doesn't explain itself enough. Creating a sense of urgency is mostly about getting the information out to everybody and justifying the change by saying it's very important because if we don't change, things will probably go in this direction. If we do change, we'll be meeting, the information that we have about our competitors is doing this and that. And so it's mostly an informational step. And each organization is going to be a little bit different. Why would you need to change? Different organizations, sometimes it has to do with competition, sometimes it has to do with practices becoming outmoded, new technologies. Anyway, that's what you'll be wanting to explain. So I'll be giving you some details to follow for each of the subsequent phases. So beyond the Cotter model, then we'll be talking about the ontological models at 6-box and 7S. The two most important ontological models, I guess the 7S really is, but it's also misleading. The 6-box a little bit plainer, more straightforward, but not really based on theory. Based enough on theory. The author says it's not, but actually it sort of is. And then structural dilemmas is an important topic in organization development and change to understand. When you look at an organization, just on the insides of it, where are the points of imbalance? So we get into equilibrium. And then SWOT analysis, which most people get wrong and the internet gets wrong. So that's going to be a very important topic. So without further ado, let's move into our Cotter change model. Let's see, I think I will begin with the article, if I can find it. There it is. Here's the original article in Harvard Business Review back in 1995. So leading change, why transformation efforts fail. Now Harvard Business Review does this thing regularly. They'll find some highly credible author, like John Cotter, who has written a book. They'll say, hey, Dr. Cotter, do you mind writing an article on your book for our publication? We want you to write the article. So it's a condensed version of the book, or sometimes a condensed version of an aspect of the book. In this case, it's pretty much a condensed version of the book. And so that's how it got in Harvard Business Review. That's also why Harvard Business Review, though, is like it's an author describing his own book. So it's not really like reading the book, but it's a good perspective because it's the author directly. And it is not scholarly because it's just the author talking about his book, right? So that's how it is. Harvard Business Review is like that. It's like they're there to say, okay, executives, hey, read us because, you don't have to read the whole book. Read this instead. So it's very useful. Anyway, so here's how Dr. Cotter starts. This is back in 1995 now, in justifying where he's coming from with coming up with these 8 steps. He didn't just say, you know what, Levine, he's got 3 steps, I got 8. Am I 8 or better? He didn't start that way. He's consulting a lot. He's finding out, when you're in a consulting firm and you find out about this company and that company and this other company, you're studying all of these things, you get really freaking smart about companies. CEO candidates are often pulled in from consulting firms for that reason. They aren't just people sitting around pretending to be armchair warriors or anything. They really know a lot about organizations through their consulting. So consulting is like going through a lot of real live action case analyses, one after the other, over and over again, using techniques that are optimally designed to have a real impact on the organization, as opposed to theoretical stuff that maybe people won't listen to. Anyway, so here's how Carter approaches this. And he comes straight out of academia. He's an academic consultant, not just some guy working for a consultancy. So there's a lot of the scholarly stuff behind him. So he says, over the past decade, he's talking about from the 80s into the 90s, I've watched more than 100 companies try to remake themselves into significantly better competitors. They've included large organizations like Ford, small ones like Landmark Communications, companies based in the United States like General Motors, and elsewhere like British Airways, corporations that were on their knees, Eastern Airlines, and they eventually collapsed, of course, and companies that were earning good money like Bristol Myers Squibb. These efforts have gone under many banners: total quality management, re-engineering, right-sizing, restructuring, cultural change, and turnaround. But in almost every case, the basic goal has been the same: to make fundamental changes in how business is conducted in order to help cope with a new, more challenging market environment. And this is the 90s. Already, it's a new, more challenging market environment in the 90s. A few of these corporate, because we say the same thing now, right? A few of these corporate change efforts have been very successful. A few have been utter failures. Most fall somewhere in between, with a distinct tilt toward the lower end of the scale. Meaning, in general, it's pretty tough to change an organization. So look, he's going to get into this, but he's thinking the ones that fail. Why it's like most of them fail. Most of them fail. At best, half of them sort of kind of succeed. Some of them succeed really well. So why is it? What are they doing? What's happening? This is what he's getting into, see. The most general lesson to be learned from the more successful cases is that the change process goes through a series of phases that in total usually require a considerable length of time. Okay, that's fine. Skipping steps creates only the illusion of speed and never produces a satisfying result. So first observation he makes is the successful ones seem to be following a certain kind of pattern. Okay, that's fine. But it's more impactful, this is his perspective, what he's found, to figure out what the unsuccessful ones do wrong and then focus on those issues, than to pursue the ones who do it right, trying to emulate them. It's kind of like when people say, hey, I read Bill Gates' autobiography, now I can be just like Bill Gates. Of course not, you can't be like that, because you can't recreate all of the happenstance that occurred in his life. And emulating somebody who happened to succeed doesn't make you the same, because you don't have the same issues. You don't even know what he's saying in the book is going to translate, right? So you don't just follow the successful person trying to be like that person. Put another way, let's pretend that there is a successful approach to something. For example, core business strategies. When Michael Porter discovered, from the economic perspective, what you need to do to adopt a consistent core strategy, well, then everybody knew, and then everybody was pursuing it. But the first one to get it, the first one who gets there is playing on a secret before anyone else knows. So there's already that added value. So then Cotter continues, a second very general lesson is that critical mistakes in any of the phases can have a devastating impact, slowing momentum and negating hard-won gains. Perhaps because we have relatively little experience in renewing organizations, even very capable people often make at least one big error. Notice he says we have relatively little experience in renewing organizations. He's talking in 1995. So how long had we been studying organization development and change? Well, at the level he's talking, not very long. But if you just think of management history, you realize all of management history is essentially trying to improve organizations. But we started with Taylor, right? Improve the organization through individual jobs. And then we get to the human relations school. Improve organizations by making the people more motivated and stuff. Okay, well, then right after that is leadership. Improving organizations by improving the leadership. Eventually we get into a combination of things. There's leadership, and there's individual, and there's group, and There's the organization level of analysis, there's culture, and all sorts of things. You have to deal with them all at the same time, along with the hard sciences, finances, everything else. And it had not been very long since they started doing that. You could argue that perhaps you can go back as far as the 70s, maybe, when we had W. Edwards Deming over here, finally got back from Japan. Well, he had prior to that, but he finally became into his own in North America after having made a name for himself in Japan as essentially the quality guy, right, the quality guru. And there were some others as well. But organizations didn't think in terms of comprehensive change until probably when, at the time TQM came. TQM became, total quality management became a big deal in the 90s. That's when everybody was talking about it. Okay, so it's in the 80s, it's hanging out in the 80s. People are hearing about it in the 80s. And prior to that, what's total quality management? In essence, aside from the quality aspect of it, it's attending to every aspect of the organization at the same time, in some sense. So nothing gets through your fingers. It's like I got all the major systems in my control. I'm fluencing all of them. So Cotter is saying it hadn't been too long. So let's just go through a few of these. So error number one, not establishing a great enough sense of urgency. Now, we always know that step one is create a sense of urgency. Notice that the step is based on the absence of the requirement. So error one is not establishing a great enough sense of urgency. Let's read into that just a little bit. So he says, most successful change efforts begin when some individuals or some groups start to look at a company's competitive situation, market position, technological trends, and financial performance. Notice he's got 4 different areas you're looking at all at the same time. This is typical of consultancies. It's a comprehensive view of the organization. They focus on the potential revenue drop when an important patent expires, a 5-year trend in declining margins in a core business, or an emerging market that everyone seems to be ignoring. These are just examples. They then find ways to communicate this information broadly and dramatically, especially with respect to crises, potential crises, or great opportunities that are very timely. This first step is essential because just getting a transformation program started requires the aggressive cooperation of many individuals. Without motivation, people won't help and the effort goes nowhere. So he's kind of working around this thing. Basically, you got a whole bunch of people in the organization. They all need to know what's going on with regard to the rationale, the foundation for the change. A change is going to happen. We don't know exactly what direction it's going to take, but we got to change. We can't just let things go. And here's the information. Here's what's going on out there. And everybody in the organization needs to have heard it, thought about it. You say, what's coming out of that? Well, motivation. You're going to have enough people in the right places in the organization stepping up to the plate saying, well, you know, we need to do something about it. Some people in decision-making roles. There won't be whole chunks of the organization like, what's going on over there? We didn't hear about that. Instead, everybody knows. And that when everybody in an open system, if you an organization has an open system, when everybody knows, when everybody is trading information, exchanging information, talking to each other about what's going on with regard to the company's trajectory, well, then the company is acting more like a true open system. All this feeding is coming from all the different people. So motivation is just like an after effect of the exchange of information. That's what you want. And every quality structure, TQM, Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, Deming Prize, any one of these formulas for improving organizations, these are award systems. At least 2 of them. Any one of these formulas for improving the organization follows that same premise. We're treating the organization as an open system. We're trying to make it act a little bit more like an open system, a little bit more self-adaptable as opposed to waiting for somebody to move it. It starts to adapt by itself. And the essence of that is everybody in the organization who's a human being is contributing thoughts and ideas. Some more than others, of course, because the people who are on the line, they can't be like stopping and saying, "Hey, I got an idea," and just talk. But still, there's the potential for them to exchange information anyway. And so that's what we're talking about here. So continuing on, he says, compared with other steps in the change process, phase one can sound easy. He says it's not. Well over 50% of the companies I've watched fail in this first phase. What are the reasons for that failure? So then he'll get into some nuances of what does he mean by a sense of urgency? Where does this sense of urgency come from? Because sometimes executives underestimate how hard it can be to drive people out of their comfort zones. Sometimes they grossly overestimate how successful they have already been in increasing urgency. They're sure everybody's on board, but half the company hasn't even heard what they're talking about yet. Sometimes they lack patience. There's a quote, enough with the preliminaries, let's get on with it, is the idea. In many cases, executives become paralyzed by the downside possibility. The fear of this might not go right. They worry that employees with seniority will become defensive. So you get these little turf issues, right? That morale will drop, that events will spin out of control, that short-term business results will be jeopardized, that the stock will sink, and that they will be blamed for creating a crisis, which I find really interesting. Notice they get paralyzed because of fears of certain things. We better not take this risk because it could go wrong, as opposed to, so basic on balance, what does that mean? That means that the extent to which executives pull back from going full force in the direction that they believe deep down to be right, after all the information they pull together, they pull back too much. They always pull back too much. That's the natural tendency. So a paralyzed senior management often comes from having too many managers and not enough leaders. Interesting distinction there, that relatively early in history. Management's mandate is to minimize risk and to keep the current system operating. Notice what he's saying here. Management's mandate, in terms of systems characteristics, is fundamentally, it's a combination of positive and negative feedback, but the positive feedback loops have to do with just the production process. Negative feedback is controlling the risk. It's stopping stuff from from vibrating too much, stopping stuff from moving around too much, in a manner of speaking. So you're as steady as you can possibly be. It takes a lot of negative feedback to steady the ship and keep it from rocking. But you put them in charge, like when you have a downsizing situation, the cesspool syndrome, well then all of a sudden everything ends up being more negative than positive. Change by definition requires creating a new system, which in turn always demands leadership. Again, we know deep down what he's talking about. It sounds simple to say, leadership, great leaders. So no, we know there's a distinction between leadership and management. We know there's a distinction between the peripheral part of the structure of the organization, the so-called leadership layer, leadership and professional staff layer, as opposed to the internal part where management, operations, and all that kind of quasi-mechanical stuff's going on. Phase one in a renewal process typically goes nowhere until enough real leaders, it doesn't mean real leaders are the ones who stand up and have big muscles and the fake leaders are the other guys. He means people who are actually in leadership positions or enacting the leadership process as they should, are promoted or hired into senior level jobs. And we'll finish this one little paragraph here. Transformations often begin well when an organization has a new head who is a good leader, in other words, into the transformation. If you're a good leader, you're into transformation. That's kind of by definition, if you understand it right. And who sees the need for a major change. If the renewal target is the entire company, the CEO is key. If change is needed in a division, the division general manager is key. Now, what he's not saying here, probably because they didn't have room for it, maybe I haven't thought about it a second, the general manager of the division isn't going to behave all that differently from the CEO of the company if you have a multi-division operation. Unless it's really separated, like it acts autonomously, we can call that a strategic business unit. There's going to be a lot of influence, that whole layering thing, that fractal issue. When these individuals are not new leaders, great leaders, or change champions, phase one can be a huge challenge. So let's just kind of skip through now. Error one is not establishing a great enough sense of urgency. Error two is not creating a powerful enough guiding coalition. You can see what step two is, creating a powerful guiding coalition. Error number three is lacking a vision, therefore it must be creating a vision in step three. Error number four is under communicating the vision, just by a factor of 10. So step four in 1995 was communicating the vision. They changed it a little bit after that. Okay, error number five, not removing obstacles to the new vision, so therefore Step number 5 is going to be removing obstacles. But you know, these are simple negations of what he ended up transforming into steps. Error number 6, not systematically planning for and creating short-term wins. And each one of these things he's saying is that he's found that each one of these is enough to derail an entire change process. Error number 7, declaring victory too soon. And then error number 8, not anchoring changes in the corporation's culture. There's another simple negation. Error number 9, sorry, there was no error number 9 because there are 8 steps. Anyway, he lists the 8 steps right here. Establishing a sense of urgency, then forming a powerful guiding coalition, creating vision, communicating the vision. In 1995, vision was more upfront in terms of priorities than it happened later. Later on, vision became less of a problem, you could kind of argue. So now, you know, a decade later, he's able to just address vision once, and then the others a little different. Oh, he's got 3 of them here. Empowering others to act on the vision, and planning for and creating short-term wins, consolidating improvements and producing still more change, institutionalizing new approaches. Okay, that is the 1995 version of this model. Now, let me just move into my little PowerPoint that I have here where I compare them. Okay, I have Cotter 2017 here. I don't have the old and new Cotter. I just have the Cotter 2017. So, if you notice, we have urgency, coalition, and vision. That's essentially the same as it was in 1995. And where it says visions, form a strategic vision and initiatives. Okay, then we get into the move. The move phase for Levine is enlist, enable, and wins. I'm using one word labels here for simplicity. Enlist a volunteer army as opposed to communicating the vision. But communicating the vision is still the issue. But now the focus is different. We're not saying you got to communicate the vision. No, it's like take it a step further. You're trying to, it's not just communicating the vision. Everybody's like, oh yeah, I heard the vision. Yeah, I'm good. Yeah, it's cool. So no, now you gotta do it in a way that motivates them. So put it another way, you haven't communicated the vision unless they're motivated after they've heard it. That's what a vision does, right? A vision inspires and it motivates. It isn't just a piece of information. Yeah, we're moving in this direction. That's cool. Yeah. No, it's people need to get into it that way. Then we have enable action by removing barriers. That's essentially the same as it was last time. Okay, generating short-term wins, same thing. Then we have sustaining acceleration and instituting change. This focus on acceleration is a new thing in 2017. Okay, so that's a very simple slide deck that I have there. But let's move into very quickly here's his slide deck. And this is in a PDF format, but it's essentially a bunch of slides. So 8 steps to accelerate change. He did this in 2017. You can go online and download it easily. I want to fix it up because every now and then there's like a misspelling or something in there, which kind of drives me crazy. Anyway, so he goes like a bunch of basic stuff, good background types of things, the sort of stuff that he focuses on. Let's see. So we have, here are the leading changes, 8-step process, 1996 it says, because it published next year. Accelerates 8-step process, 2014. So same thing, only different. These are not the steps, but they are the premises. So in 1996 is respond to or effect episodic change in finite and sequential ways. 2014, run the steps concurrently and continuously. Now, people always have the same complaint about every step-by-step change model. They always say, look, the model says you do this, then you're done, and you kind of sit around and look at each other, and then you move to the next step. They don't really say that. It's just that they're always listed that way. Step 1 looks like this, step 2 looks like that. Whatever the model is, it's always like that. Whether you understand them as being, well, of course, organizations are dynamic. You'll be moving and you'll be pursuing step 3 over here and step 2.5 over here, and step 4 over there, and there's going to be some looping back a lot. But we all know that. We know that would apply to any model. It's not a new discovery. It's not like 1996 it was really like this, but it is kind of interesting that Cotter's folks are saying, well, yeah, let's pretend in the old days it was like that. So why would it be? Because that was a common criticism of it. Because it looked like you take one step, you sit around, twiddle your thumbs for a while, then you take another step. That's what it looked like. I don't believe it was ever true, and I don't think Cotter ever thought it was true. But it's a motivating observation to describe it in this term by making it look like 2014 is fresh and new and it's accelerated and all that stuff. Okay, so let's see. We move down here to, here are his little 8 all around that little circle. Very nice and neat. Okay, says create a sense of urgency. Then he starts to get a little more detail in here, which you can review on your own. But notice what he's doing with his sense of urgency. He isn't saying get everybody like scared or something. He sort of is, but he's implying it. But he's also not saying use emotion. He's saying show them the information, show them the actual data of what's going on. Notice what it says here. It's this nice additional, very concise information that gives you more insight into what he's after. So your top leaders must describe an opportunity that will appeal to individuals' heads and hearts and use this statement to raise a large, urgent army of volunteers. So the first thing you notice is that he's linking creating a sense of urgency with step 3, which is creating an army of volunteers. Step 3 or 4, whichever one that was. Anyway, so he's saying, see, this links directly to it. Appeals to individuals' heads and hearts. That, of course, is saying it's information as well as the emotional, the sense of need, the motivation. But the whole idea is the information is supposed to produce this reaction in people where they're like awake and ready to go. It isn't just supposed to get out there in their heads. They sort of they take it in passively. It's supposed to motivate them. Again, it won't motivate unless it's really a vision, because visions are designed to motivate. An ineffective vision doesn't motivate. That's why we call it ineffective. So it's almost like saying this is how you can tell it worked. This is how you can tell the vision's a vision when it does the job. So sense of urgency is intimately tied to this idea. What is a vision? How are you conveying it? All right, so let's move down into, notice he ties it to an opportunity. So opportunity is the good thing you're after. Let's move down into the guiding coalition. The volunteer army needs a coalition of effective people. Notice he's talking about the volunteer army again. He's going to say that again a couple slides later. But he's saying we're trying to go there. The whole point, the whole big kind of intermediate focus is we're trying to create that volunteer army. A whole bunch of folks in the organization who are really enthusiastic and you're going to go above and beyond, and they're going to help you out. All right, then we get into formal strategic vision and initiatives. That's number 3. So Dr. Carter defines strategic initiatives as targeted and coordinated, quote, activities that are designed and executed fast enough and well enough will make your vision a reality. Now, the speed issue, he talks about you can't go too fast, you can't go too slowly either. But it has to be a sense of fairly quick movement. It can't be a sense of, well, any pace is okay. If it's too fast and people, their heads are spinning. But it will have to feel like there's energy. So it's got to be fast enough to create a sense of energy. And you got to be like balancing it out, listening out, see what people are talking about in the organization to see how you're doing. Okay, then we get into, here's your volunteer army fight. Large-scale change can only occur when a very significant numbers of employees amass under a common opportunity and drive in the same direction. Notice, actively engaged employees. They're actively engaged. They like the organization, they feel good about these possibilities, they're enthusiastic, and then they're raring to go. And there's your volunteer army. Again, it's just members of the organization who have awakened and they really want to be a part of it. All right, then we get into enable action by removing barriers. This is the same thing as 996. So let's see how he has it. This time he says, by removing barriers such as inefficient processes or hierarchies. So here's, oh, that's what a barrier is, huh? A process that's like, if you mapped it out, you say, why has this process got so many steps? Couldn't we remove these steps and combine these steps? And basically suggesting, look at the process level while you're engaging in a change project. I'm going to say project to avoid saying process twice. Look at the process level, and you'll realize that at the very least you can say one process at a time. Do a value stream mapping action on the process. That's essentially the definition of Kaizen, in fact. You map the process out on the board and you look at it and say, okay, this is how the process actually works? I don't know, sir, I haven't done it yet. So, okay, let's walk through it. Let's go watch him, or let's walk through it. How does the process work where you go get your driver's license? Say, well, it's according to the website, you do this, that. No, don't go to the website. Go there and do it literally. Walk through the actual process. That's what you want to try to. because processes sprout little legs and things everywhere. They do extra stuff that wasn't there before. For example, imagine this. You set up a process. We're transforming this thing into that thing. It's an input to the next part of the deal. Okay. So you set it up. Everything's cool. You're management. You're not watching. The employees notice some contradictions along the way. They kind of look at each other and they say, hey, how about if we do this? And then they add stuff to the process. They add sub-process to the process. Nobody knows, but there they are. You can kind of tell whenever you do this, what do you call, you take on a new position in a new part of the company, and then the employees are designated to show you certain things, teach you certain things. So you're learning. This one employee who's been there for a while, say, oh yeah, here's how we do the such and such. I'm told I'm supposed to teach you how to do the such and such. Okay. Well, the customer's over here, and you input this over here, and then you don't realize as a new employee that this individual might have shortcuts or extra things that violate essentially the original process. You're learning them. Eventually, you're like interacting with people, and they call you stupid because you got the process wrong. Oh, look at the newbie. He's such an idiot. And that's because the process mutated. The process is mutated. So you always want to walk through them. Notice inefficient processes. It isn't that it was designed inefficiently. It might have been, but usually it became inefficient because of sprouting legs and things. Instead, it turned that way. So Cotter down here says, innovation is less about generating brand new ideas, more about knocking down barriers to making those ideas a reality. It doesn't have to be just giant new ideas. But an organization that starts kind of running aground. Think about this: inefficient processes that used to be good. Maybe they haven't been streamlined or anything, but they're pretty good. And then they kind of get encumbered through sub processes because the employees on the line are trying to solve problems. Those new solutions become routine, and pretty soon the process that you would learn as a newcomer is more complicated. All right, what's the organization done in a theoretical sense? It's gotten more articulation than before. It's scooted away from entropy. It is less likely to be able to change on its own now than it was before. If you just multiply this encumbered process out by several other processes, and pretty soon you're like, well, the organization got a little heavy for some reason. Nobody knows why. And it's because of that. Now let's run through the rest of this. Okay, step 6 is generate short-term wins. This is interesting because look how it describes it. Wins are the molecules of results. Okay, that's a metaphor. They must be collected, categorized, and communicated early and often to track progress and energize your volunteers to drive change. So 2 things going on. 1, you achieve these wins, but you forget to tell everybody. And you forget to tell everybody. It's kind of hard to describe. Well, yeah, it's a point. You have to work at describing it in a way they understand. Hey, folks, we did such and such. We did this thing. And you have to be able to encapsulate it in a convincing enough package so that people understand what it is, as opposed to having to deal with the complexity. And then the second thing is generating short-term wins is necessary because you need to maintain that energy in the employees. They may have started out all enthusiastic, but enthusiasm only lasts a while before it starts to kind of taper off if they don't see stuff happening. It's like they're like, yeah, what happened to that change process we're going through? Oh, I guess it's just old news, huh? Okay, I'll just get back to work then, because nobody's talking about it. And we got number 7, sustain acceleration. And here's where we've already made all the changes now. By step 7, we're trying to get it to stay in place. We're institutionalizing, is what we'd say. So in 2014, he says sustain acceleration. Change leaders must adapt quickly in order to maintain their speed. Whether it's a new way of finding talent, that would be one process change, right? New way of finding talent. Or removing misaligned processes, another way of making a change. They must determine what can be done every day to stay the course toward the vision. So what he's talking about in terms of sustaining acceleration, again, the first step in institutionalizing change is answering this question: what are we supposed to do every day that keeps this thing in place? It's kind of like when you tell yourself on a personal level, you know what, one of these days I want to get past all this rigmarole. I'm gonna start a business, or I'm gonna do this great thing. And you have to ask yourself, what are you doing right now to make that happen? It doesn't mean, well, right, I got too much stuff to do. too much stuff on my plate. I can't move on it yet. So what are you doing now? A little bit, right? A little bit of something every day that will move you in that direction. Are you like, you want to start a business? Are you reading up on stuff about the business? Are you every now and then fiddling with a potential business plan, doing something, or are you just dreaming it all these years, and then all this the weight of your responsibilities stay in the way, and you never get there. So you're saying that you may have made a change in the organization, but if you don't then ask yourself, what do we do every day to keep this new way in place? Then it'll snap back. That's not enough, though. The last one he says is institute change. To ensure new behaviors are repeated over the long term, it's important that you define and communicate the connections between these behaviors and the organization's success. And so here he's just trying to put a capstone on it. Right? So one thing to say, what do all the people in leadership positions, managerial positions, what do they have to do differently every day? And another thing to say, okay, now what we, from our observation perspective, what are we watching others do? How are we rating our employees? How are we rating our subordinate managerial staff, let's say? How are we incentivizing them to stay in this new path? Did we move from individual structures to team structures in some unit? And if so, did we just tell them to make team structures and then we said, okay, everything's fine, but we're still appraising them on an individual basis? Are we still paying them as individuals, as opposed to figuring out some algorithm to allow what the team produces to be funneled a little bit into as bonuses or variable pay? You know, what are we doing in terms of incentives? So that's where this thing ends up. So that's essentially it, and that's how I put this together. Levine, remember, he says unfreeze, and he said a lot of the same things, but in a more general kind of way. Notice what he says under unfreeze. Change employee attitudes, right? Foment discomfort with the status quo. Plan the new behaviors and processes. Task organize the change process. And I should emphasize, under unfreeze, we don't really know what the change is going to entail, but it sort of looks like it. If you don't think about it, you're like, well, yeah, we know what the change is. So no, you have to study this, to analyze what's going on. When you know the status quo is not sufficient, it doesn't mean you already have to have the answer. It's that you got to get everybody used to this idea. The status quo is not sufficient. We think we're going to have to move in this direction or that direction, but you know, we're studying it. We're going to let you know. And then by the time you get to move, you are more in that track of having a better idea of where it's going. The vision isn't always it doesn't necessarily have to be something, or I should say, a vision is not normally something so concrete as to say that the vision equals the solution that we came up with to this status quo problem, to this competition problem. If you say we have to change because the competition is just, they're way ahead of us, something about the technology, then you're thinking, well, then we have to do probably something about the technology too, but we're not sure what it is exactly. Do we team up with that company over there? Do we do a big investment? Do we find some other technological partner? What do we do exactly? All we know is that technology has something to do with it, if that's how we describe the current crisis. And so the vision then is always going to be we will be ideal in some way. We will be, let's say, if you think it's technology that's doing it, the competitors have, we will be technologically sophisticated in some sense. But you're not saying, here's how we're doing it. The how we're doing it is going to come in the move phase. That sounds funny because it seems like you have to have all your answers. But organization development and change doesn't entail a starting position where you say, we know what the answer is to the question before we've done the analysis. You have to do the analysis. So if I just very quickly, if I had to compare the phase model to normal action research, the first thing you do is diagnose the organization. You go in there and you ask them questions, you surveys and things. You try to figure out what's going on. You need to know what the strengths and weaknesses are of the organization. What are those things? You don't go in there and say, well, you know, the organization, they're not successful anymore. And then assume, well, I know what the problem is. They need new leadership or they need new technology. You don't know what the problem is until you diagnose it. So if you think about it, every phase model is in some sense a type of action research. Because remember, action research is typically 4 phases. It's a type of action research. That means that those initial phases, those initial steps, are diagnosing. You're diagnosing, you're figuring stuff out while you're doing this. Just that Cotter is saying, well, I'm not having you discover, I'm having you get everybody excited so that the collection, the collective of all those people thinking thoughts and throwing ideas around, that's where the information is going to come from. So I think that's probably enough for that one. So with that said, let's take a little break and then move into our ontological models. Continuing on, ontological models. Okay, now for this, I have a PowerPoint presentation. There it is. Ontological models. These are the 2 big ontological models we like to teach. One is more practical in terminology than the other. But the point of an ontological model, what does ontology mean? It means what is there. Okay. An ontological model is, here's a model of all the categories of stuff that are in this system. For example, a map legend is an ontological model of the kind of symbology you use in a map. So why do you say ontology? Well, because it's a funny way of saying what is there. It means being. Ontology in philosophy is the study of what it means to be, right? It's about being. Like deontology is a different word. It's what it means is what it means to have a sense of duty. And then there's epistemology, what is knowledge, what does knowing mean? These are branches of philosophy. But so an ontological model then is describing for a particular domain what's there. So we have the 2. Notice we have little pictures. Okay, so the 6-box diagnostic model looks basically like this. What we have is essentially the result of kind of a scanning of the literature, you might say, on what are the big systemic underpinnings of an organization that happen to be treated in the literature, because scholars at some point they've pretty much gotten to all of them. And so what are the big ones? Well, there's a lot of literature on defining the organization's purpose, and then what happens when you don't have a sense of purpose. So purpose is one. Purpose, goal clarity, goal agreement, mission. It has to include more than just what's written there. If you say, well, where's mission, where's vision, where's these other terms, those are in there someplace. So they have to, these other terms that we know are underpinnings of organizational trajectory or organizational structure, they have to be in there someplace. You can't just say, well, for example, performance appraisal, well, that doesn't go anywhere because it's not listed, so it belongs somewhere. Everything that's a thing belongs somewhere, so that's kind of what we're after. But we're going to see that when we unite the models, when we combine them, with the understanding that every ontological model that's, in essence, complete for its own purposes, should be able to meld with another one and say the same thing, even though the language is different. But by pulling them together, not only do we cross-validate them, but we also enrich our understanding and we confirm our understanding of each of the components. So the purposes basically have to do with the core business, goal clarity, goal agreement, mission. You want to improve purposes. Maybe the purpose is not clear. Maybe there's a goal clarity problem. Structure then, what's structure? It says structure over here on the right. It says, how do we divide up the work? These simple questions are just this is the original author trying to guide us in the way of thinking. Remember, this model comes from an article that he's written with a whole bunch of explanation. And then the model is just kind of a summation. Structure then, work division, the fit between goals and your structure. Are you covering all tasks? You start to get it. Notice what structure. Are you getting into Bowman and Deal's structural dilemmas? Covering all tasks is one of those structural dilemmas. Are you covering them all or not? Are there gaps in your coverage? Do you have too much overlap? People stepping on each other's toes. Types of organization, of course, functional versus divisional, that sort of thing. Okay, we'll get into relationships. Conflict management. Conflict management is the only thing that the author happens to mention under relationship, but there's a little more to it than that. People-to-people relations, people-to-technology relations, unit-to-unit relations. You notice that people-to-people relations is a thing. So how do you manage that? Well, it isn't just conflict management. It isn't just, here comes a conflict, let's do something about it. It's broader than that, but then the author simply simplifies it. Unit-to-unit relations. What mechanisms do you have, without calling them mechanisms, because you got another place for that, that mediate these connections? Rewards. What would rewards be in terms of the traditional structure of an organization? Well, rewards belong in HR, don't they? Okay, well, then that's what he means. But he's focusing on the incentive aspect of it. So do all needed tasks have incentives? Do incentives link to personal growth and achievement? There's a distributive justice question. Are incentives equitable, merit-based, as opposed to disenfranchising people? There are extrinsic versus intrinsic rewards, of course. This is, when we say, do incentives link to personal growth and achievement, or let's say, do incentives connect to what processes need to be occurring in the organization? Put it another way. Well, now you're touching on one of Cotter's issues. Have you, in the institutionalization phase, have you made sure the incentives fit? I say up here on the right-hand side, visual models that display, in effect, all elements in a structure from a theoretical or practical perspective are ontological in nature. Ontological models serve mainly to offer reminders to keep from overlooking key elements. So what do you do with them? You do diagnosis. You figure out, see, the ontological model, therefore, occurs in Cotter's first three phases. That's where you're working with. That's where you're trying to figure things out. Or in Levine's first phase. In action research, the same thing happens. You use an ontological model to figure out what areas the organization is supposed to look at. See? So it's kind of a reminder. It's supposed to be theoretically based. I say down here in green, it says they are often atheoretical but still useful if they're good. Now, one test of the 6-box diagnostic model and the 7S model is if they integrate effectively, then they cross-validate. And yeah, they're probably good models. Leadership, does someone keep the boxes in place? I don't like the metaphor, but that's okay. Do leaders define organizational purposes, vision? Do leaders defend institutional integrity, ethics, connection to external environment, equifinality principle? I'm connecting it to open systems, as you can see right here. Connection to the external environment. Helpful mechanisms then. So, what is that about? Say, well, technology. Doesn't say it. Yeah, but do we have adequate coordinating technologies is how he defines it. Do mechanisms, for example, policies, rules about doing this, that, SOPs, do they link all of the functions? What's technology in this sense? It isn't just wires and buttons that you push and stuff. It's applied knowledge. It's technology in the sense that we saw when Burke was reviewing the literature on what areas, like in the Friedlander and Brown paper, what areas have organization change publications investigated, and then they divided it. Well, it's basically two. One is the person side of things, the other is the task side of things. Task side of things they call technological, but it doesn't mean wires and lights and electricity and stuff. It means all applied knowledge. Basically, it's the task stuff, organization. Scheduling and sequencing. There's Kanban, just-in-time, lean methods, value stream mapping. Do we do these things? Again, it's so technology is you have automation, let's say, robots and things, but also how have you arranged the work? How have you applied the knowledge of the work to get it done? That would include all the quality management stuff there in the model. Okay, now we get the 7S diagnostic model. Now the 6-box model, the categories are okay. Labels could be maybe a little bit better. But in the 7S model, the labels are a little bit problematic. And why is that? Because they decided they're all going to start with the letter S. As soon as you get any model that either spells a word, like SMART goals, for example, or consists of a list of words all starting with the same letter, like the 7S model, you know some are going to be some compromises. Some are going to be misleading, because you got to find a word that starts with an S. I mean, it seems obvious. But people get lost in these things. I tell you, I've had people write papers. They tend to get in the 7S model, and most of the time, more than half the time, they think style must have to do with style, because that's what it says. So they say our leadership style is, you're like, well, you're not interested in leadership style. It has nothing to do with an ontological model. Leadership style, that does not belong in an ontological model. Leadership in some sense does, but not leadership style. Style means culture. Style means organizational culture. But why do they say organizational culture? Because it doesn't start with an S. So that's the simple stuff that screws them up. Skills don't refer to skills either. Notice you have staff down here and skills up here. So, well, that's funny. Staff sounds a little bit like, you mean the people? What do you mean by that? Is that some HR thing? Well, skills sounds like HR too. You're not going to have an HR component in two different places. It's just one sort of thing. So skills actually has to do with organizational capacity or organizational capabilities. What the organization can do as an organization, not what the individuals can do, not whether they can type or not, whether the organization can produce components and stuff, whatever it's doing. But you had to say skills because it starts with an S. Staff, of course, you had to say that instead of HR because HR doesn't start with an S. And the rest is okay. And superordinate goals, of course, they had to start with an S somehow, so they added a word. It was probably a good idea. So superordinate goals, guiding concepts, organizational vision, shared values, strategy. Interesting, strategy. How come strategy is not in this other model? Where is strategy? But if it's a thing, it must be there somewhere, even if it doesn't say so. So we'll get to that in a second. All right, strategy, your competitive logic, your business strategy, your core strategy, corporate strategy, your structure. Notice strategy, by the way. We always get about half the classes in the military, or more than half the classes in the military. Strategy doesn't mean quite the same thing. Strategy in a business is you, as an entity, you have to position yourself so that you can succeed, essentially in an economic sense, with respect to the environment. It is not, your worldwide combined arms strategy as applied to some country. That's not what we mean at all. Strategy. So we can say core strategy, or so-called business strategy. You can apply it to military organizations, but it's really hard. I remember training the Latin American officers at WINSEC for several years, and I had to recreate this whole game, this simulation thing. And I had to reason through how to apply the idea of core business strategy to the public sector, to a Ministry of Defense kind of structure. It was quite tough, but you have to get into real abstractions there to figure out how that works. And you're not competing on the same basis. You're given a budget. You know, it's not like you can be a cost leader or differentiator. That doesn't quite work in the same way. But strategy there is still a sense of strategy at the unit level if you can think it through enough. But you can't allow yourself to get confused with private sector in that sense. Structure, we have work division that fit with organizational goals. That sounds familiar because it said pretty much the same thing in the 6-box model. Centralization versus decentralization, that's a Bowman and Deal structural dilemmas kind of thing. All right, then we have systems, all processes and procedures, formal and informal, we're reinforcing our sources of competitive advantage. Technical core, the repeating process, of course we get that from Lynn, that 80% of activities that creates all company value. Skills, as I say here, organization level capabilities. What do we do especially well as an organization, not as individuals? Core competencies, of course, fall under skills in that sense when you interpret it that way. Mutually reinforcing capability clusters, usually with linkage across functions, hard for outsiders to understand or imitate. Core competencies was a big deal in our strategic research. Prahalad and Hamel came up with that. And the idea of a core competency is when you have this combination of functions in an organization, they happen to work together so well because you got good at it, maybe by accident, then you recognize it, and so you reinforce it. Other companies have a really hard time trying to figure out how to replicate it because it's got too many little connections across different types of organizational subsystems. Then we got staff, that's basically HR. Notice individual skills belong here, not under skills. See, KSAs belong under staff. Style, organizational culture, then the other stuff about culture. Has nothing to do with leadership style. Okay, then we compare them. This is what we get. So the conventional nomenclature works like this. 6-box model, they say purposes. 7S model, superordinate goals. That is the correlation. That's the correspondence right there. We would probably say, distancing yourself from the specificity of the model, organizational vision and mission. All right. Notice strategy is not in there. So you make the argument it should be in there. But notice that 7S model has separated strategies from superordinate goals. So we're going to treat it differently. 6-box model also separated purposes from leadership and then defined leadership in a specific kind of way. So strategic decision processes, leadership in the 6-box model is where you define strategy. So purposes and strategy are separated here. Notice that we have vision and mission kind of hooked together in that first one, because the idea of the mission is the mission is how you define yourself. Here's what we do all the time. This is true now. We're going to try to do better this year, but we always do these things. Vision is, and in the future we're going to be this. Now strategy would be like, that's how you get there, if anything. Strategy is how you position yourself with respect to your competitors. It's the path that you take to get to your vision, but it's a how as opposed to the what. And so separate the two. Leadership, of course, in Burke's conception is this transformative aspect of the organization as opposed to the risk averse aspect of the organization, which is management. And then we get to structure. And structure in the 6-box model corresponds to structure and skills, because skills are core competencies and organizational capabilities in 7S model. So 7S model has separated them out. You can kind of see why. It sort of makes sense. But it would be organizational structure and core competencies. Okay, then rewards, that's human resource management staff. So 6-box model, hey, where's HR? Well, it's rewards. You think maybe it's relationships, but you say, no, wait a minute. That's where organizational culture goes, because organizational culture has to be in there somewhere too. That's relationships for 6-box model, and then 7S model is style. So that's what makes sense. That's how everything is linked together in kind of a soft way, in terms of a common mental model. Then helpful mechanisms corresponds to systems. We call that processes and procedures. And so, again, at the bottom I say ontological models taken as a whole must always cover the same ground as one another if their objects of analysis are the same. So we're going to have a chance when Burke goes into ontological models, of all things, he skips the 7S model. So that's going to be considered part of the chapter when we touch on it. But for the moment, we'll be like, okay, this is where you get that information. And this is where you're going to get all of these correspondences. You're not going to find this anyplace else. All right, well, let's see. We're on track again. Okay, let's let that sink in. We'll take another break and we'll move into our structural dilemmas. Moving into then Bowman and Deal's structural dilemmas. Now, we've taught this regularly for a while. This is a convenient model, so I can figure out where I put it. Let's see, structural dilemma. There it is. Okay, structural dilemmas. And it's particularly useful when we consider organizations as open systems because it suggests certain points of equilibrium within an organization, or there should be equilibrium. So, well, what do you mean? Well, dynamic homeostasis takes on practical dimensions in this model. They don't have to say it like that. Bowman and Deal were pretty excited, but the first time they published this, and they started publishing updates and created a whole textbook out of this structural dilemmas thing. But so basically it works like this. So many organization change interventions directly or indirectly involve the organization's structure due to the challenge inherent in erecting suitable constraints and enablements into the organization to optimize internal equilibrium. Bowman and Deal expressed this managerial challenge as involving structural dilemmas, binomial decisions that managers must make along a limited array of strategic axes in the organization. Now, a lot of times they're going to be worded as this is there, this is not there, or this is there a lot, this is there not enough. These kinds of oppositions. But in a matter of speaking, it's like there are two. It's like a semantic differential scale, you might say. There are two opposite ideas, and we're supposed to be somewhere in the middle to have the right equilibrium there. So if we lack equilibrium, if the equilibrium is off, what does it imply in terms of open systems? They're not going to tell us this handout, but essentially it would imply that we are not as much of an open system as we should be. Remember how I said all the quality management frameworks, the Deming Prize, the Malcolm Baldrige National Quality Award, Total Quality Management, and the others, even the ISO 9000 series, it basically can become more or less the same sort of thing. Each of these quality management models, frameworks, is premised on the idea that if you follow this process, we're not trying to refine you as though you're a well-oiled machine. We're trying to make you more into a true open system, but the processes are efficient. You're going to get that out of the deal. The numbers are very precise. Six Sigma comes along, and all of a sudden you're like, wow, this is so precise, I can't believe it. But the fact is that the structure, what they all have in common is that you're becoming more like a true open system. Well, structural dilemmas are doing the same thing, in a manner of speaking. If you say, we've identified an imbalance here, like under here, it says differentiation versus integration. Too much differentiation going on here. All right, well then, you scooted a little bit away from that optimal place where you should be to be maximally capable of experiencing emergent phenomena in your organization, new ideas cropping up, little edge of chaos action. You're a little too structured in a certain way. Notice you can be on either end of each of these little so-called dilemmas, and it's like you're structured too much in some sense. Structured too much in one sense, structured too much in the opposite sense. When you're structured too much, you're scooting away from entropy toward that mechanistic thing, that kind of thing that makes it harder for you to change when you need to. So I continue here. I say Bowman and Deal identified 6 configurational axes, each of which demands careful analysis and an explicit policy position in conformity with the organization's broader strategy. So here are the axes. Differentiation versus integration. So you kind of work it with these are such short descriptions that they don't necessarily capture everything, but say tasks can become too differentiated. What do I mean? Too much specialization going on. Well, specialization makes sense in certain quarters or in certain places. So like the old factory structure with a lot of specialization. Think with the old factory structure. People were put in positions where they essentially enacted the role of some mechanism. People were mechanisms. There wasn't a lot of this, there wasn't anything about core job characteristics or anything like that. People were mechanisms. In part, that was driven by the need to be able to employ people without having to train them that much. So I said, well, okay, well, it's one way to do it. Now, Frederick Taylor didn't quite do it that way. He had the same idea of breaking a job down so that it's as doable as possible. So it was simple in that sense. But he didn't have to worry too much about, well, we can't talk to the people because they're Jewish immigrants from Central Europe and they speak a funny language we don't speak. Right? There was a lot of that later on in history in the United States. And that kind of promoted the idea of breaking a job down into just very, very simple routine movements. But over-specialization now is the norm if we say, if we're looking for a problem of this kind. Over-specialization, it's the temptation these days when you structure an organization is to specialize too much. Because we have a history of specialization used to be a thing that worked for whatever it was worth, and we got over it. Now we need people in jobs where it's like, oh, look, you're doing these things here and doing these things and these things over here as well, but we're using as much of your brain as we can manage. To the extent we can create a job that uses your brain, we don't want to use only a little teeny tiny slice of your brain. We want to use more of it. The job is more motivating that way. It works better. And the effect, of course, is the organization is more flexible, more adaptable that way. So I say, as tasks become more complex, the organization can benefit from the efficiency of specialization. Contrarily, each increment of task differentiation creates another point of articulation that will require integration into the larger organizational structure. So, so right here, it says differentiation has no impact on integration. This is trying to simplify it as much as possible. If you differentiate a bit more, if you divide the task up a bit more, do you have to do something to integrate it? Do you have to do something to coordinate the new differences? And you say, oh no, we can easily divide this job up into two pieces. You guys do that, you guys do this as we get bigger. No problem. All right, well then it's unbalanced in that sense. Every time you differentiate, it should have a little effect on integration. It just shouldn't be every time you differentiate, it has just as much effect on integration as the energy that you put into the differentiation. It's got to be a little bit. So you want to be able to differentiate on some level, integrate a little bit to make up for it. You don't want to be having to spend as much time and effort on the integration or coordination aspect of keeping jobs straight as you did by dividing them up, if that makes any sense. Okay, that's so differentiation can be a problem, and the inability to integrate can be a problem. Here's gap versus overlap. Now, some of these are going to blend into each other a little bit. That's the nature of organizations. But tasks without clear assignment to identifiable positions or units may go undone to the detriment of the whole organization. So, well, what would that happen? Well, it's surprising. Remember what I said about a process starts out, maybe written up fairly well, and people are trained and they do it, and eventually the people on the line run into issues they can't solve. They didn't anticipate this. And so they start adding process steps to make it work. Same kind of thing here. You can find tasks that somehow have cropped up and defined. Maybe somebody left was carrying this task. Now nobody's doing it. All kinds of little changes happen when we're not watching. Same kind of a thing. It's an evolution, kind of a weird evolution that happened. Contrarily, tasks assigned to more than one person or unit, whether explicitly or by default due to ambiguity in guidance, can cause wasted effort or conflict, actually. Okay, some key tasks go unallocated. That's the kind of thing that's hard to figure out sometimes, but a little investigation. Notice it's telling you, it's saying use this as a diagnostic model alongside the ontological models. Same idea. You're trying to figure out what's going on in the organization. If you were a consultant and you had this basic tool here, you brought the literature with you, you look for ways to measure it aside from this little bitty handout. You'd be like, well, this is a pretty good way to diagnose as well. This is showing us some things we need to know, all having to do with the equilibrium points. It's the only thing that this one sheet has in common across all these items. They're all equilibrium points. Key tasks go unallocated, or too much overlap exists between tasks. Think about team structures. The team structure there should be no pure overlap between two team members. If you can possibly handle it, if you can possibly manage to keep things in place, the roles have to be different. Here we're saying tasks instead of roles, but otherwise fundamentally the same thing. Now, in a big organization, you have a lot of units where several people are doing the same thing. So you're not worried about everybody having a different role, but in a team you would. You can kind of see how that would work here, though. Too much overlap is still a thing, even when there is such a thing as people teaming up and doing the same job across within a unit. Okay, underuse versus overload. Employees with too little work. Oh, this is so common, especially nowadays with more sedentary types of jobs. Employees with too little work may suffer boredom or exploit their free time to engage in unproductive activity. I recall hearing about a particular person in a managerial position, and people say, well, managers, they need every now and then they need to be able to sit back, put their feet on the table and, think about processes and stuff. Well, that's true, but this one was reading Harry Potter in his spare time. I don't think he was getting any inspiration from doing that. So, contrarily, employees who routinely experience task overload may suffer impairment of their capacity to serve fellow employees or customers. Now, what's funny about this one is, like, it may not even be termed correctly, but this is what Bowman and Deal gave us. The thing is, either you get sort of a balance across in terms of employee utilization. They all have full-time jobs and everything's cool, or you get weird. Some employees are taking on too much, some are taking on too little. But here it's kind of like it looks like it's one or the other, when in fact both problems occur at the same time normally. Anyway, so employee underutilization is evident. It's one extreme. Employee task overload is apparent. And you're like, well, in reality, we find some employee underutilization. We're going to find some employee task overload on the other side. We're going to find some of that too, because they happen together. So it's one of those fancy little things. Lack of clarity versus lack of creativity is interesting. Remember, too many rules out there, and people all wrapped up in a web of rules, and they don't have any. There's no creativity that's going to come out. Too few rules, and they might lack a sense of focus. So we have here, vaguely defined job duties may invite an employee's work to drift into inappropriate territory and undermine productivity. What is it? Okay, job duties are not defined well enough. Let's say an employee does this, that, and this for the sake of this thing, and spends too much time on this one fun thing. Let's say this part I like, this routine thing I love. When I get the chance to do Excel sheet, I just go overboard with the Excel, and so you get this imbalance among the different aspects of the task of a single employee. So that's a possibility. That would be if the job isn't defined well enough. Now you might say, well, the job is defined perfectly well 10 years ago. It should be the same now. So now things change. When you have, just kind of compare it to your team experience again. You're on a team. You set up your norms. Everything's cool. So you're going for a bit. We can't be on teams for very long in this course, but imagine your team for like a year, 2 years. And then the team then takes on its own little issues, its own little structure. And so there's a push and a pull in the team that tends to mold the norms in a particular direction, mold the roles in a particular direction. After the initial, as a derivative of what you established at the beginning. Well, the same thing can happen here. You can have a perfectly well-defined job. And again, that's sort of imperfect if you think about it, because the job is defined well enough, the employee took it over, and eventually it didn't take too long before the employee is running into issues. How do I solve this? How do I solve that? And then solving them, creating new routines within the job, that nobody knows about. That happens too. This is the natural push and pull and natural pressures of in a real organization, a real open system. People adapt and then they make it work. But you don't know that the job description in effect has changed a little bit, has mutated a little bit, and it may not be structured correctly anymore. It could be that the training that's associated with the job is not matching anymore. Things change. So I say, contrarily, extremely specific job descriptions, rigid enforcement, rigid adherence can cost the organization needed flexibility and service quality. So we have roles lack appropriate clarity, role definitions are too narrow. Those are the opposites. Okay, number 5, excessive autonomy versus excessive interdependence. As I said, some of these will overlap a little bit with the others. Excessive autonomy in a job position. Well, I can do whatever I want. Oh, wow. Can lead to a sense of isolation or uncertainty regarding how to approach certain tasks. When we go into Hackman and Oldham's core job characteristics, and we say autonomy is one of them, you have to have the right level of autonomy for your own level of experience in the job. We don't mean more autonomy is always better. We just mean it has to be the right level, and it tends to be a little more than you give on average. But still, the newcomer needs to have less autonomy and need to have a sense of adjusting that autonomy over time. Otherwise, ambiguity sets in. Now, the experienced person can take ambiguity just fine. Oh, ambiguity, I can do what I want. I'm going to solve all these problems myself. I know how to do it. But the new person can't take the ambiguity. Different. And then on the right-hand side, we have employees need more self-guided work because there's not enough autonomy. So I say, contrarily, excessive interdependence among job positions. Like I'm doing this job, and I'm still waiting for Joe to give me his part because I don't know what to do. That's interdependence. Can stifle employees' adaptability to changing organizational needs. Too loose versus too tight. This is very common. I've seen this a lot in the literature. People studying this one little aspect of the organization. Lack of accountability can lead to control failures. When we talk about control, we mean mainly measuring things. Control has three facets, by the way: feed forward, concurrent, and feedback. The feed forward control, that involves steps that you take to set up a process. There's your feed forward control. You can find certain processes in organizations, a lot of times, will have only feed forward control steps. And then the process just sort of takes off by itself. That's it. All the guidance was in the feed forward aspect of it. Concurrent, while the process is going on, what are you measuring and how are you influencing? And feedback control is when the process is done, what numbers do you look at? What evidence do you have of how the process went? So we say, let's see. A lack of accountability can lead to control failures. That's control failures in that sense. Contrarily, efforts at very close monitoring employee work can cause demotivation or incentivize employees to find ways to circumvent the intentions of the system, thereby undermining productivity. So here we have the opposite. Employee controls are too loose, employee controls are too tight. And this is going to be overlapping with role clarity a little bit, because your role is clearer, right? If you have enough information. Maybe say you don't have enough information about your role. So do this thing and do it well. Oh, okay. Oh, do this thing, do it well, and follow these steps. Oh, okay, it's a little clearer. Well, controls, when it says, here are the specifications for the role, do it like this, those are actually feed-forward controls. So it overlaps with number 6, you can see. Anyway, so that scale thing is, take with a bit of a grain of salt. So I explain here in the bottom. Regarding the scale item below each structural dilemma, scores from 3 to 5, if you can take it literally, would suggest the structure is already sufficient. So if you're weighing it, you can imagine you probably don't just like look at this. You kind of look around and say, see, where's the wind blowing? Not quite that vague, but there'd be ways to figure this out. Interviewing employees or something, right? There are things you can do. So if a whole bunch of them come back and say, oh, there's too many controls. Oh, yeah, there's too many controls. That's right. Oh, there's too many controls. Everybody's saying it. So, well, okay. Then you're in a 6 or a 7. You think, right? So more extreme scores, that is a 1 or a 2 or a 6 or a 7, suggest a need to revisit the structure and reposition constraints and enablements to restore equilibrium. So back to my basic starting point, saying Bowman and Deal came up with this intriguing idea, intriguing way to look at internal equilibrium points within organizations without actually branching off of systems theory to do it. But it's another example, and it's the previous example I mentioned, where you have a lot of explanation of practical representations of equilibrium points in organizations, or practical representations of dynamic homeostasis. Well, that was in Anthony Kakmar and Paraway's HR strategy book, which you can still get a hold of, but I don't think they've continued to produce new editions of it. But it's a great source of very practical guidance on, from an HR perspective, where the points of equilibrium are. Well, Bowman and Deal have given us points of equilibrium or potential disequilibrium in an organization based on generic, or let's say universal structural features. Pretty good. They're not all extremely easy to understand, I guess, because you have to get into the nitty-gritty, but you can kind of see where an imbalance would suggest, regardless of what direction the imbalance is, there is less ability to adapt to changes in the external environment than there otherwise would be. You can differentiate a task, it has no effect on integration. A very simple example. If you can differentiate task, hey, well, from now on, how about you guys do this part of it and you guys do that part of it, and you don't have to coordinate, well, then it was already divisible. And so, since they weren't given that option before, They're like, well, there's a point of not adapting to pressures. It never even occurs to the people on the ground, hey, let's do this ourselves, because they're not allowed to differentiate. Then differentiation has an effect on integration. It would be the opposite. It may be a little bit subtle, but the point is that at least to a great extent, and some of these more than others, these points of potential disequilibria are practical representations of dynamic homeostasis in organizations, such that if you find yourself in an extreme position, you can bet that you're less adaptable, you have less ability to adapt spontaneously to changes and pressures in the outside world. And then so you're more likely to go for a long period of time as an organization kind of rigid and structured and resisting change until that punctuated equilibrium thing happens, and all of a sudden there's a big kind of crisis and very rapid changes. All right. Well, that said, let us do one more little break and we'll move into SWOT analysis. Okay, moving into SWOT analysis finally. Here we go. SWOT analysis, where you go? There it is. SWOT analysis. Problem with SWOT analysis, the most common problem with SWOT analysis is that people think opportunities refer to suggestions. Like when they get to opportunities, no matter how many times you tell them, I swear it's happened, it just doesn't seem to sink in. An opportunity is not an opportunity. You don't say, well, you know, this organization has certain opportunities. It can go in this direction, go in that direction, the other direction. This is great. Opportunity. No, that's not what it is. The point is that these are structural features. Strengths and weaknesses are literally the same thing in terms of basic description, but one is a benefit and the other one's not, right? Opportunities and threats then are similarly literally the same thing in terms of basic description, but one of them is working in your favor and the other one's not. So it can't be threats are, well, you know, the government may come after us, but an opportunity is, well, you know, we can develop this new software. Because you can't say software development, you can't position it in negative. It's already given as a suggestion. You know, let's work this through. A SWOT analysis helps strategists clarify an organization's current competitive position, of course. The identification of strengths provides a sense of the organization's leverageable resources. Notice I say, the identification of strengths provides a sense of the organization's leverageable. I don't say the identification of strengths, that strengths are leverageable resources. It's an implication, it's implied. Weaknesses indicate gaps to address. Weaknesses do not refer to gaps so much as activities that need to be kind of revisited, refined, and improved. Opportunities suggest, they imply how to maneuver the organization to benefit from favorable trends and conditions in the environment. But the favorable trends and conditions in the environment are the opportunity. They are descriptions of the trends, the descriptions of the conditions. Threats highlight where to focus the organization's defensive strategies. Okay, down here we have the key consideration of SWOT analysis is the correct identification of each element, of course. The two common fallacies in SWOT analysis are, one, confusing the four elements, of course, and two, being too vague in specifying them. Two supporting models, namely key success factors and political, economic, sociocultural, technological analysis, help strategists construe the elements correctly. Now I have this little example of SWOT analysis in a table. Most of the time people think of a SWOT analysis and say, well, it's that little table where you write these words. And, you know, got S's and W's and O's and T's. It's sort of, kind of, it's not really the full reasoning, but I did take some time, in most cases, to put something in there that more or less made sense for its category. Sometimes there's a positive or negative term thrown in to add to it, so opportunities have some, there's a couple like falling trade barriers. Instead of just trade barriers, if you describe trade barriers as your label, you said opportunities, well, they must be falling then. Threats, well, they must be rising. So same thing, same wording, only one's good, one's bad. Opportunities, customer segments. If it's an opportunity, it must be that there are some new customer segments out there that are sort of emerging. If it's a threat, that must be you're losing customer segments. So that's what it would be. So I could reword it a little bit and make it better, but that's a little bit more in the right direction. Too often I've seen also people really just playing with these things. Strengths, weaknesses, somebody writes customer service. I recall when I was teaching the undergraduates, one of them in particular, he would just blurt out customer service and answer to pretty much any question. It's like sometimes it made sense, except he wasn't actually thinking about anything. And so under strengths and weaknesses, you put customer service, because who knows, you know. Anyway, so here's a way to control the SWOT process to get it a little bit closer to right. We start with key success factors, with the idea of key success factors and pest analysis both. But the key success factors, that's a way to approach the S's and W's and make sure you're not picking the wrong thing. Because imagine this, if you have no guiding template by which to define what's a strength, what's a weakness, what is a possible strength or weakness? Well, you know, we got a great buffet. I think that's a strength. Oh, really? Buffet. Oh, we got a great new CEO. I think that's a strength. Is it? We have a new janitorial crew. I think that's a strength. Why? Well, we like them. We got some pets. We let dogs hang out here now. We pet them and everything. I think that's a strength. Okay, well, then, not everything's a strength. It's conceived as good. So Andrews came up with this idea back in the early 70s. Key success factors are activities that every organization in the industry must be able to perform adequately for a reasonable chance of success. So you say, well, before I can figure out what my S's and W's are, I have to ask myself, what are we supposed to be good at anyway? What does, not just us, what does any entity just like us have to be good at to succeed? Oh, well, you know what? You need to have a process that does this. You need to have a process that does that. You need to have this process, that process. Okay, so among those little processes that I just got through listing, those are going to be our strengths and weaknesses. So you can say, in order to define your success factors, key success factors, notice it's a very specific term, key success factors. And if you ever look it up on the internet, key success factors, a lot of times you get people literally using that term meaning something completely unrelated. And most of the time, key success factors, when you see it in the literature as a set phrase, refers to this. There's something else out there called critical success factors, and that's just a term people use. It's not even very specific. So key success factors is a special term when you use that the way it's structured. When you're defining key success factors that would apply to you, don't talk about yourself. Don't talk about your organization. You talk about the industry, or you talk about your peer entities. All organizations like ours should be able to do this thing, this other thing. Get a half a dozen or more of these little things that you got to be able to do well to succeed, that are specific enough to be necessary for the industry, but not so generalizable enough so that you just like customer service. One of those things. How is customer service a necessity? Well, everybody needs to do that. Yeah, not specific for your industry. So we basically think of all of our peer institutions. We say for them to succeed, for any one of them to succeed, let me list these qualities they need to be good at. When I'm done with my list, I'll have this nice little set of descriptors. And then I'll be able to look at one organization and say, okay, how are you doing on that one? I'll say, you're above average or below average, you know. And there's more than one way to do that too, but I'll get to that in the second part. So I say, a fast food enterprise, for example, should be able to achieve quality consistency, stable product quality. This happens to be one of the things they should be able to do. So where'd you come up with that? Well, you think about it, say, do they have to be high quality? I don't think so. So it's not quality, it's what they're after. But the quality can't be allowed to vary a lot. Oh, that's it, that's right, yeah. If you're specifically a fast food enterprise, you got to be able to produce consistent something or other that's fairly good, right? But if it varies too much, then it screws up the whole equation, because people will be driving around and say, oh, there's one, well, last time I had a really bad burger, I'm not going there. You see, so a fast food enterprise, a fast food franchise operation is decentralized in terms of its corporate structure. It's very decentralized. You got different entrepreneurs owning different outlets. That means there's a potential for variability. So in order to combat that, you need that stability. So there's stuff you think through, right, to get these right. So that's what that needs. A retail operation needs to have a process by which to determine markups on products. You can kind of tell when you go around them. You have some retail operations, they routinely review product pricing on the market and make their adjustments. Sometimes they add a flat percentage depending on, well, sometimes just add a flat percentage across the board. Sometimes like you'll find these places where they add 10%. Like they sell it to you at cost and add 10%. It doesn't really explain everything, but that's what they do. And there are others that'll be like, well, we calculate turnover on the shelf for each product. It's enormous and bunch of spreadsheet stuff if you really think about it. But the turnover itself tells us how much to mark up the product. If the turnover is rapid, the markup is low. If the turnover is slow, the markup is high. You can do a little math and calculate it out. But there's got to be a way to do that. And there are certain approaches to it. There has to be a sense of how much breadth and depth do we achieve in our product mix. You know, like you're Aldi, and you're like, well, we keep it narrow, a very tight product breadth, maybe 2 choices of each thing, something like that. Others would be like, well, we want several choices of each thing. Some places are like, well, we don't want to have everything. We just want certain kinds of items, and then we ignore other items. And others are like, no, we need to have a little of everything. So you have to have a clear sense of that, so there's no inconsistency. So all of these are potential KSFs in, let's say, that particular environment. So once you know what a KSF is, then you say, okay, well, what should we be good at to survive in this industry? List. Okay. Now, go through that list and say, which one of these, it's just what I'm saying here in the second part, which of these are we best at? Well, we're pretty good at that one. Oh, no, this one, yeah, we're really good at that one. And yeah, I think that's it. Okay, put it at the top. Okay, now after that one, now what's up? Well, the other one I mentioned, I'll put that one next. All right, what are we really bad at? Oh, that one, we're really horrible at that. Put it on the bottom. And pretty soon they're in order by your best at this, then your second best at that, all the way down the bottom. That's actually a simplified approach to organizing into strengths and weaknesses. You already know what your candidate strengths and weaknesses are because you figured out your KSFs. Now you put them in order like that, and you just kind of draw a line in the middle. So it doesn't really matter too much whether you're above the one in the middle or below the one in the middle, but you draw the line in the middle. You say, if we're all into continuous improvement, clearly everything in the bottom half, we're constantly trying to improve. But you don't want to find yourself saying, well, we stacked up all of our KSFs, and it turns out we're better than everybody in all of them, so we don't have to do anything. But that would be a little bit contrary to this idea of organizations adapting to changing their environment. So this simplified approach makes sense. Now you'll find different in some other course you'll find this. Well, no, you can't just rank order them and then do that. I would say start out like that anyway. But then at some point you got to do a little analysis of your industry. Well, our competitors are doing this and that and this, and so we rank about number 2 in that, number 3. So you're doing a kind of a competitive analysis. But my perspective is, especially with military organizations, you may be the best at a whole bunch of those things. I mean, I guess it's good that we don't have to compare the entire U.S. Army, because that's not supposed to be the thing you're analyzing. It's always supposed to be your unit, right? The unit to which you belong, not the whole thing. Well, the United States Army, to be an armed force, to be an army, we need, then you list them all and you say, actually, we're best at all those, so nothing to do here. I say, yeah, well, we're not analyzing armies around the world. We're analyzing artillery battalions or something, right? What do all artillery battalions need to be able to do? Or maybe what are all nuclear capable artillery battalions supposed to be able to do? And you list all those things. So anyway, so I say every KSF is either a strength or a weakness. By definition, if you identified the KSFs correctly, that's all your possible strengths and weaknesses. Now it's just a matter of categorizing them. So it's fairly simple if you do it right. I'm surprised the number of times that I've taught this and then I've asked people to do SWOT analysis and they skip the KSF part. Say, what happened? Oh, they went online because they don't watch the lectures or something. Okay, pest analysis. This is a little more interesting, I think. In the first place, people say, well, what about pestle analysis? Well, pestle analysis was a stupid innovation by some jerk back in the 90s, back when everybody thought that environment was a thing. And they applied it to everything. They would take a model. So I remember Kaplan and Norton's model, where they have these four measurable criteria. It's a good model. Their balanced scorecard. And then somebody got a hold of it and said, oh, let me throw in environment. So it doesn't make any sense. You have to understand, what do you mean by that? People are just non-critical. And then they get these things published, which is really worse. Okay, so pest analysis was originally ETPS. It was originally 4 factors. It wasn't originally 6 factors, like in pestle analysis. So I write here, originally conceived as ETPS in Aguilar 1965, the PEST acronym captured 4 distinct facets of the organization's external environment. What Aguilar was doing in that dissertation was just scanning all the literature, trying to figure out, okay, what are all these different things that we're supposed to analyze in the environment to do a proper, strategic scanning kind of thing. And he balled them all up into, that's 4 categories. All right, so what does that mean? Well, if we understand the 4 categories was essentially a good theory-based idea, we don't want to be like adding categories, especially pestle analysis takes the P, and because you can't easily spell a word without when you add an E, because nobody wants to say pieced, I guess. The folks who decided to add the environment to it took the P and said, well, that's called political legal. Why don't we just put political here and legal over there? Well, now you're taking one factor and doubling the attention that you're giving to it, which doesn't make any sense. It's completely ridiculous, all because you're trying to spell a word. It drives me nuts when these people do. Anyway, so the PEST acronym, what we want to do is review the environment for things that are moving, conditions and things that are moving, conditions and trajectories. So political legal. Why political legal? So that's the rule-based structure of any economy. So you're in an economy, there's a society that kind of around it, it's the country, it's the state, whatever. There's a rule-based structure. We call it political legal. Some countries, the political process is very much decree-oriented. Other countries, it's very legalistic, but it's the same thing. It's the rules that you have to work by. So they say, well, what's going on? Well, let's see. Always look for regulation. Right? Is regulation just kind of steady, or is it increasing, or is it high, tight, or is it low? Well, if regulation, if the regulatory aspect of your external environment seems like it's about to increase, about to get tighter, about to get worse, well, then we call that a threat. But when we're doing pest analysis, we just say regulation appears to be on its way to getting tighter. We just stop with that. Well, we know we've implicitly described a threat by saying that, because regulation bad equals threat, regulation good equals opportunity. That's basically it. If we say regulation is dropping, that would literally be the same thing, only opportunity. Opportunity defined as regulation is falling, regulation is low, one of those kinds of terms. We wouldn't say opportunity is well, we can take advantage of the new law and do this, because that's going beyond the description of the state, the description of the condition or the trajectory suggested by that factor. So in political legal, we always talk about regulation doing its thing. And then we have economic, which is the second one. Is the economy, at least as it affects your particular industry or your folks, right? Is it opening up and surging? Is it just staying flat? Surging would be good, flat would be bad. Okay. The competitive environment also applies to economic analysis. What are your competitors doing? The competition is tighter, competition is looser. Sociocultural is that next one. Sociocultural refers to the market. Is the market growing? Is the market shrinking? Our tastes moving more in the direction of the kinds of things that this industry offers. Once, just like a KSF analysis, by the way, when you do pest analysis, you talk about the industry. Try not to talk about yourself, just the industry or your peer institutions. This force out there affects all these peer institutions in this way. Makes life tough, makes life easy. And then technological, of course. Technology is difficult, technology is easy, technology is changing a lot, technology is becoming more complex, anything having to do with technology. They say, well, what about environment? How come that's not in there? Well, it's all over the place. Political legal, for example. Does the government have environmental rules and things? That would be under political legal. Okay, sociocultural. Does the market respond to environmental this or that? Like they prefer an organization that's doing environmentally friendly stuff or not? So it's there, and it can be under technological and economic. It's mostly under the P&L. So it's already there. You don't have to be adding stuff just because it's a fad. And so that's how you do it. So it's quite simple. Result the analysis. You list your organization's strengths and weaknesses, then list the opportunities and threats. In the case study, the SWOT analysis section should be explanatory in nature. Don't be adding the bullets. You're trying to explain things. Okay, that's kind of an underpinning here. Okay, then inferences from this analysis should shape a case study by identifying organizational priorities on which to focus while solving basic problems. So what are we doing in a bigger sense? We're doing a SWOT analysis, the S&W. We're diagnosing, once again, we're diagnosing an organization. We're diagnosing, in this case, based on the activities that should be going on by which the organization would succeed. And we inferred those activities by looking at thinking about it, all the peer institutions and say, well, what do they need to succeed? We say, well, we must need the same stuff. And so some of them are going to be good, we're going to be good at, we're going to call them strengths. Some of them we're not going to be so good at, we're going to call them weaknesses. And then the other aspect of the SWOT analysis, the OT, and then we can go back up using the pest analysis. Now we're actually diagnosing the external environment in terms of how we interact with it. So we're doing a diagnosis of internal and external, and then trying to put it together. And that's what SWOT analysis is for. Again, it's another diagnostic model, if you think about it. So I ended with this caveat on strengths and weaknesses. Remember that KSFs must be entirely under the organization's control. In other words, when you say, what do all peer organizations need to be able to do pretty well to succeed in this industry? Well, those are KSFs. They have to be what the organization is doing. You can never say, well, they need to have a loyal customer following. So no, that's not up to you. Well, you may be lucky enough to have a loyal customer following. That's really great. But your internal activities, either they're reinforcing that loyalty or they're taking it for granted, or whatever, but that might be an activity. In entertainment, do you need to have processes that foment a sense of loyalty among customers? Maybe. That might make sense. But this process you're looking at, it's the activity inside the organization that's either a strength or a weakness. If you think it's supposed to be there, then you determine whether it's a strength or a weakness. So, for example, KSFs can never include the fact that customers really, really love your product. Because customer needs are an opportunity. It's different. What's going on the outside of the organization is not up to you. And it would be somewhere in pest analysis. KSFs only refer to what an organization does, can do, or has achieved. Ignore any advantages or disadvantages the organization may have due to forces outside its control. Also, strength or weakness has to be true right now. It can't be like, well, if we do this, then we can add this strength. So that's beside the point. Either it's going on now or it's not. Okay, caveat and opportunities and threats. The most common mistake in identifying opportunities is in describing them as a suggestion, such as by observing that the organization could or should sell its product overseas. That would be a strategic inference, maybe out of a SWOT analysis. Well, we did a SWOT analysis. Oh, that's a great SWOT analysis. What do you think? Well, you know what? I think based on this, maybe we could sell our product overseas. That might be a good idea because it says this over here, right? But see, the SWOT analysis itself does not say sell your product overseas. That would be an inference you draw out later. SWOT analysis says there's demand for products like yours overseas or something like that. It's a state or a trajectory. So the actual opportunity is there's a market need for this thing. How the organization might respond to it is a completely different question. It does not belong in the SWOT analysis. That would be saved for later. Remember, you're diagnosing an organization, diagnosing the environment. You're not saying what it should do with it. You're simply figuring out what's going on. Then I do mention this one thing. Another thing about SWOT, about the pest analysis, the pest part of the SWOT analysis, opportunities and threats. You can include likelihoods of changes in the forces. Like when I say, you don't just say regulation is tight, therefore it's a threat, or regulation is loose, therefore it's an opportunity. Those would be true. But you can also say regulation, again, this is unique to opportunities and threats. We don't do this as strengths and weaknesses. Regulation is likely to tighten over the next few years. That likelihood, even though it hasn't happened yet, we say, well, that's a threat too. Regulation is likely to loosen over the next few years. That's an opportunity. Literally described as such. Regulation is likely to loosen up. So you can include you can include likely changes in these forces in the opportunities and threats, but not in strengths and weaknesses. All has to do with the logic of how an organization is supposed to be adapting to its external environment. That's what the SWOT analysis really is all about. It's just a very traditional, very well-established strategic approach to working out that the organization's ability up to that point to have kept up with its external environment. So I think that's enough for that. Again, this is midterm week, so in order to do well in the midterm, remember to collect the feedback from the quizzes. You can use that as notes because it's an open note quiz, open note midterm. And review essentially the slides from the chapters, but also review the slides are pretty good. They're already going to tell you more or less what I focused on in my lectures. But in the lectures, you want to focus on the special topics, the things that I added, the so-called beyond the textbook, those little blurbs, because those will be on the midterm as well. And I know a lot of people like to do an open test, an open book kind of midterm, and they just take the whole thing and dump it into ChatGPT or something and do whatever it says. You might get a C on it, I suppose, if you're lucky doing that, but you're not going to get a good grade because ChatGPT and its fellow AIs are just not that effective at this sort of thing. So anyway, with that said, I think that covers it all, so we can call it quits. And remember, next week is not going to be a live meeting because I'll be on the road. I'll be instead preparing my lecture on my own from there, and I'll be posting it again Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, sometime of next week, as though it were an actual live lecture, but so I can still cover all the same stuff. So with that said, we will see you all again online and wish you all luck as we move into the second half of the term.